Hi, I'm Corey Deacon, one of the founders of Neurvana Health. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to check out our YouTube channel. If you struggle to find a lasting way to feel better and want to achieve the health you deserve, reach out to us and we'll figure out how to get you the help you need. We've helped clients from all over the world get to the root cause of their condition and find a long-lasting way to feel better. To take the first step, go to nirvanahealth.com/go and book a 30-minute consultation with one of our healthcare advisors. I look forward to getting to know you. How does depression affect brain structure? This is a complicated question because not only does depression affect brain structure, but brain structure affects depression. And brain function, which is different than structure, will also affect depression and vice versa. So it's a bit of a complicated question. I'm gonna dig into this a little bit deeper. The areas that are affected in depression, and the reason I say it in this sense is that depression is a symptom, generally. Okay, so people aren't depressed for no reason. There's reasoning behind the feeling of depression. Depression is just what we see on the surface. It's the symptom. So there's a lot of underlying brain chemistry and brain function going on that's driving those symptoms. And the most common cause for that is actually a long-term chronic stress response. So at first our stress response activates. It's like that feeling when you almost get into a car accident and you get an adrenaline rush, right? It's like that feeling, but it's more low grade and it goes on and on and on and on and on for a long time. Now, this is stress that we say is maladaptive. Essentially, it means that it's an adaptive response that's bad in the long term. So in a short term burst of stress is really beneficial as long as our stress comes back down to a normal level. With depression, oftentimes what happens is the stress response is activated for so long, usually years or decades, that eventually we start moving into a state that we now call a dorsal vagal state, which is based on Stephen Porges' research. It's also known as the faint or freeze response. I also call it the play dead response. And it's actually the state that the brain goes into in order to withdraw us away from our social environment because it's too stimulating. There's too much stress going on. There's too many resources required to be engaged in our social environment around us. So our brain, our nervous system has a survival response that withdraws us away, essentially screaming at us that we need to heal something. And evolutionarily, this was beneficial because if I'm a gazelle out in the middle of the safari and a lion jumps out and starts chasing me, I need to be able to run. And I run until I get caught by the lion. And then I need to play dead. I need to hope that lion leaves me alone enough for me to get away. When I get away, I don't run back to the group and bring the predators back to the group. I actually stay off and I hope that I heal, right? These earlier mammals, they don't have hospitals, as we know. So they hope they heal. And in that process of laying wounded and healing, there's a whole nervous system shutdown that goes on in order to give us the best chance of surviving. And that actually will cause feelings of hopelessness, feelings of helplessness, feeling overwhelmed, right, to the point of shutdown in some cases. People will also get depression is kind of mixed in with that. And then there's another interesting phenomenon that happens that is part of a lower part of the brain called the periaqueductal gray, and we call it the cockroach brain. It's the very, very, very deep part of the brain that we don't have conscious control over. All of a sudden, it starts dialing things down to create sensation that we may die. And so there's actually suicidal ideations, and better yet, we call it preparation for death. The brain actually starts preparing for the fact that it might not make it. It's very interesting because as humans, we put ourselves there through chronic stress, thought, and other underlying issues going on in our body. Alone, we don't actually need to be in a life or death situation. So that's what can make depression very confusing for people. They'll feel like they don't want to live, And a lot of people will say to me, well, I'm not suicidal, but sometimes I don't want to live. It's actually that state that's pulling them down in order to prepare them for death. And that's how deep they're getting into the wounded state, and it's all based on brain function. So that's the number one reason that I see people go into depression. And so we work to try to find the reasons why they're getting driven to that state. Now, other factors that are affected when we look at the brain and we look at a brain map or we look at functional MRI imaging is there's usually hypoconnection, which basically means all of the wiring that's running through our brain, it's very vast, it's very complicated. It's not functioning right. It's not sending messages from one area of the brain to the other. Now, there's a specific network called the salience network. It's our threat detection network. It uses 30% of our body's energy when it's working properly. If it's overactive, it will use more, which is why people who have depression and anxiety tend to get fatigued as well. Fatigue becomes a big factor in these symptoms. The salience network is starting to burn more energy, and what's happening is it's looking for threats everywhere. And it will disconnect us from another network that's more frontal called the central executive network, and it retreats us into the back part of our brain, which is a network called the default mode network. Most of it sits in the back part of the brain, and this is the internalization. So when we try to have a conversation with somebody, if all we think about and if all we can connect to is the thought of them, what they're saying, what we're saying back, and what it might mean, and we're overanalyzing and we're overthinking, and we go, oh my God, maybe I shouldn't have said that, or should I have said this different? And then we go on with the rest of our day. We leave that conversation, and for the rest of the day, we're thinking about that conversation and how maybe we should have said things differently, did things differently. We have a lot of language around we should, we could, we would. We start feeling guilty. We start having difficulties with decision making. And this is all part of the area called the precuneus. It sits right on the back of the crown of the head. And so a lot of times we'll have retreat. We retreat. Our brain actually forces us to retreat back to that area, and these networks now start dysfunctioning. So we have a difficult time engaging socially. We're not even interested in it most of the time, right? Definitely not interested in sexual activity, which is why people's libido also goes down when they're having issues with depression. And now we're retreating into our own head, and we're just stuck there, right? Very commonly, there's crossover between focus issues and memory issues because of that. If we have cortisol levels, which are a stress hormone, that's too high or too low, our hippocampus doesn't function properly. And the hippocampus is a memory region in the left and the right side of our brain. And it's very important that our brain is able to connect to those memory centers consistently, and it's constantly doing it. It's essentially the part of the brain that associates things. So when we see something, hear something, feel something in our body, smell something, taste something, that information is relayed to the association centers so that we can associate it to older memories. Being able to connect to that is very important for us to regulate our mood. And when that doesn't function properly because of stress hormone being either too high or too low, now we're not able to regulate our mood well, and we tend to go into a lower idling rate as far as our mood function goes. Now, there's another subtype of depression that relates to the prefrontal cortex as well, and our ability to emotionally regulate. So when something happens to us outside of ourselves, we need to be able to make sense of that and regulate it, right? Much like we would regulate our own stresses or anxiety. With the prefrontal cortex, if it starts idling at a lower rate, which can happen from inflammation, it can happen from trauma, early trauma, which is related to another system called the limbic system, or if it's in a low metabolic function, which can happen from head injuries, from thyroid hormone issues, sex hormone issues. All of a sudden now that prefrontal cortex can't function properly, and we again start retreating. We can't connect to our pleasure center, which is more frontal left. We can't even connect to our avoidance center. So some people will say it's like they don't feel. And this is also a phenomenon that happens when we're on antidepressants. For some people, it's like they're just numb. Nothing's exciting. Nothing's anxiety inducing. You just kind of strolling through life kind of in a half-dazed state. And a lot of people come to us because they don't want to feel that way anymore, and that mostly has to do with the prefrontal cortex. These parts of the brain, a lot of times I get the question, can we fix this? Right? Is this something that I can fix, or is it something that I have to live with forever? I always say it depends who you ask. A lot of people are under the assumption, and this includes medical professionals, that once you have something called depression, you can't get rid of it. You're stuck with medications for the rest of your life, and this couldn't be further from the truth. My experience, and from what we've worked with in our clinics, is that you can get out of this depression because it's not a structural abnormality and it's not a moral failing. It is a functional issue in the brain. Something is causing the brain to not function properly, and the symptom that happens from it is called depression. So, simple answer, yes, you can. You just have to figure out what kind you're dealing with and what the reasons are that are causing it. Thanks so much for listening, guys. I hope I could answer some of your questions on depression.